What's up, bodyweight warriors, and welcome back to another video. And today we're going to be talking all about golfer's elbow, as you can probably tell by the title. This is going to be a bit more of a conversational video. I've been doing a couple of these lately, and the reason this actually came about is that I posted a video covering, in my opinion, the best way to bulletproof your forearms when it comes to bodyweight training and handstands. And part of when I was researching for that video, I came across a lot of things that reminded me of my golfer's elbow rehab. And I sort of put out on that video, I said, do you want to see one where I go in depth into it? And you guys said yes, and this is that video. Obviously, it's something that I've personally experienced, and I can really empathize with the people who have suffered from it, because although it seems like such a minor injury, it is one of the ones that's particularly frustrating because it affects so many movements and it just seems to go on for a long time. So I wanted to kind of talk about, my own experience with it, some of the things that I found that work, some of the things that I found that doesn't work. But more than that, because at the end of the day, I'm just a glorified PT, although I consider myself relatively well-read on the subject, and I try to always educate myself further. I'm not a physio, which is why in today's video, I've got a couple of guests that I had a chat with, and I've recorded some conversations. Those two guests are Adam Meekins, who I've had a podcast with before. Adam is the sports physio online. He's an evidence-based PT. I think he's very bullshit-free and specifically getting stronger as a way of getting rid of injuries. Love Adam's approach, and he's got lots of great stuff for this video. And then there is also David McGettigan, who is he's a sports rehabilitation guy, but he's also a PDTR qualified practitioner. Now, he is a pain and movement specialist. He deals with pain specifically, and there's a lot of things that both David and Adam touch on in relation to pain that I think is really interesting that I'm going to include at the end. But overall, they gave some great answers and some great feedback in terms of what could be causing your injury to persist, and some general advice to go about it. So without further ado, let's jump into this video. Let's jump into the bread and the butter of it, which I'm going to split into three different parts. Number one is to do with assessment of the injury. What is this inside elbow pain? Number two is some treatment ideas. So thoughts around, does soft tissue work help? Does steroid injections help? What sort of rehab you should be doing? Should you avoid it? We're also then going to finish up with what's the long-term perspective when it comes to healing and kind of dealing with pain, because certainly with this elbow issue and a lot of injuries in general, they can persist for a lot longer than they should do. So that's basically it. Links to everything will be in the description down below, as long as timestamps. I'm going to try and make this video as quick as possible, but as you can tell by the rambling already, it's probably going to be like 20 plus minutes. Okay, so number one, let's talk about assessment. Now, I'm briefly going to go over what medial epicondylitis is, or golfer's elbow. So medial elbow pain can encompass a variety of diagnosis. This could be ulnar neuritis. It could be a tendinopathy. So this is when we're talking about medial epicondylitis or golfer's elbow. That's a tendon-related issue. But it could also be, again, ligament instability or trauma. There's many different reasons that we might be getting that medial elbow pain. But for the sake of this video, we're assuming that it is medial epicondylitis, it is golfer's elbow, it is tendon related. In terms of what can cause this, I think Adam answered it best. And what populations do you find that you usually come across who suffer from even the lateral side, the tennis elbow?
So again, it's a varied mixture. So it can be in the more active athletic populations, but it can also be quite common in the sedentary non-athletic populations as well. But another way of pissing a tendon off is to keep it in a poor environment for a long duration, and that means not loaded, poor hormonal balances. I see that quite a lot. I see a lot of females going through hormonal changes that get elbow tendon related pains, and diabetes as well. So blood sugar levels, all that sort of environmental stuff can piss tendons off just as much as overload or underload. People that are training a lot can overtrain, and that can affect their systems. That can cause systemic reactions in their bodies. Females that train a lot are prone to this relative energy deficit syndrome called REDS, which causes lots of issues. Sometimes bone stress reactions, but I should imagine also tendon related problems as well. So it's just keeping an eye out for all the potential factors. But you're right, the athletic population, it's more likely to be overtraining, overloading.
So as you can see, there's lots of different factors that can be involved with the reason you have an injury. It's not just as simple as it is overuse of these particular tendons. The common definition that is given to golfer's elbow is going to be the flexor pronator tendon degeneration. Basically, repetitive motions of forced wrist extension, forced forearm supination. Again, this could come from generally like pulling work. This is a common one that causes the golfer's elbow to flare up. But certainly it can be other factors as well. It can be lifestyle related, it can be diet related. And the REDS thing, and certainly the not eating enough is very common with injuries, which is why I would actually make the recommendation, if you are injured, if you have got this golfer's elbow or any other injuries in general, I would like to see people gaining weight whilst they're on a rehab. Now, this sounds wrong. A lot of people, their reaction would be like, okay, I'm injured, I can't quite do as much exercise, I'm also going to cut calories so I don't gain any fat, for example. You need to make sure you're eating enough calories to ensure that you can recover from the thing that you need to recover from. This doesn't just mean like cramming your face with loads of crap. It should be good calories. That goes back again to that systemic inflammation that Adam mentioned about, things that can also piss off tendons. But you need to be eating enough to recover from the training that you're doing. It's important to eliminate things and understand what is actually the issue. As I mentioned, it could be several things if you're having pain on the medial elbow. It's unlikely, but it could be many different things. And you're not going to know that unless you get the advice from a professional. As much as I would love to think that you can get all of the information out there on the internet, sometimes applying that information and understanding it properly is hard. And this is where you would pay a professional and go see a physio and go get a full assessment and rule out those other things. And I've personally been there myself. I've been like, no, I'm not going to see a physio. I'm just going to research it and I'm going to figure out myself. Like, no, if I broke my arm, I would go to see a doctor in an emergency center. I wouldn't just like sit at home and Google how to fix a broken arm. It just doesn't make sense. So that's enough of the assessments. I feel like the point is pretty obvious. Let's go talk next about treatments. Now, the first thing I want to go over is the non-exercise treatments. So that would be myofascial work, hot and cold contrast, and also steroid injections. Now, steroid injections I want to touch on first because I personally am not a big fan. I didn't actually ask Adam or David about this because I completely forgot. Now there is a paper by Stahl et al. And it basically compared a group of 58 individuals and it was testing the efficacy of the injection of steroids for medial epicondylitis. Seems pretty relevant, right? So they gave half the people the injection and they gave half the people the saline solution, and then they compared the short-term and the long-term effects, which I think is the best part about this study. So now it should be noted that these steroid injections are really commonly prescribed because they treat the symptoms. They work in the short term. They reduce that inflammatory response, they reduce the pain, and they let you do the thing that you want to do. But it doesn't help with healing. It just helps that symptom, as I said. Actually, that inflammatory process is useful for healing. It tells our body that we need to recover. So after 6 weeks, the steroid group were doing much better than the non-steroid, the control group, because they didn't have that decreased perception of pain. But at 3 months and at 1 year, there was actually no difference between the groups. Absolutely none at all. And in fact, the authors of the study basically say that they think this is down to the natural discord that this injury takes. It recovers by itself, and the injections were just simply a way of managing the pain in the short term. I personally wouldn't recommend them. That's my own opinion. That's not related to Adam or David. But I think the reason I would ignore them is because that pain is sending an important signal. And this is something that David actually summed up really well.
And then for me, it's all right. So if pain is there, it tells me simply that that person is needing protection. So if there's no structural injury, they need protection for some reason. So if I start to look at you, for example, and you have golfer's elbow, I would, and I know that you haven't got, let's say you've had a scan on your elbow, you've had an MRI, or you've had an ultrasound or something, and it shows nothing. There's no real structural finding that explains your injury. Then we have to start considering load. We have to consider movement capability at all the joints, the whole system. Then we have to consider potentially what your belief systems are about it, your fear, your worries, your anxieties, your labels, your diagnosis. Are you maybe just trying to do something that's beyond the level of conditioning that your tissues can just handle at the minute?
So next we move on to myofascial work, or that self-massage stuff. This is probably, I think, the most common thing that I see when you're kind of looking on YouTube for advice when it comes to golfer's elbow. And to be honest with you, I'm just going to let Adam talk this one through. A lot of people's first reaction is, okay, you got to ice it. Or you go on YouTube and you type in, golfer's elbow or whatever, and they'll be like, okay, you got to rub it with 2 fingers for a long period of time.
Yeah.
Which, to be honest with you, when I say that out loud, sounds that I'm on the wrong video topic. But what's your take on first approach with hot cold exposure, or hot cold contrast, or anything like some self myofascial sort of work?
So,
and I'm trying not to be leading with this question, by the way.
The first thing I'll say, that there's very little harm in it. There's nothing really wrong in it, but there's also not much right in it either. It doesn't tend to do much either. It can temporarily modulate a sensation of pain. So, if you want to just, make it feel a little bit different for a very short period of time, then this sort of stuff does that. But it's not a quick fix. It's not a cure. It's not something that is essential or necessary to do. Don't think it's going to speed up healing, which is a term I often hear a lot. People say, increasing blood flow by rubbing it. It's nonsense. The only thing that increases blood flow into a tendon, because, medial elbow pain, medial elbow tendinopathy, it's a tendon-related problem. The only thing that encourages blood flow into a tendon, which has a very low blood supply anyway, is active physical movement. Rubbing a tendon doesn't increase its blood flow demand. It increases the blood flow to the skin above it, but not to the tendon actually that's the problem.
It doesn't hurt, but it doesn't help either. But certainly through my experience with this injury, like I remember, if you go back and watch some of my original golfer's elbow videos, you can see that I was going to do like a million different types of soft tissue work and this ice and hot cold contrast, and probably that lasted like 2 weeks, and I was like, this is not making any difference, I'm just going to stop. And that was just kind of my personal experience of this. The same goes for like topical treatments as well, whether that was like deep heat or using some essential oils. Like, it felt like I was doing something, but ultimately it felt like it did very little at the same time. Okay, there is a neutral effect when it comes to the soft tissue stuff and the topical treatments. What actually helps? Well, blood flow for one is important, and Adam again talks about this very nicely. First of all, so do you think blood flow is an important aspect to tendon rehab?
Yeah, I mean, blood flow, is the thing that, brings nutrients into tissues and removes waste products out of tissues. So it's essential for our body's ability to maintain its homeostasis, its balance, but it's also essential for, improvements after injury and damage to structures. And movement creates, changing of fluids from one area to another area. So yeah, blood flow is important into a tendon. But the good advice should be, right, you don't have to stop loading. In fact, if you stop, you're probably going to make things last longer. It's probably going to feel more uncomfortable for a longer duration. So keep loading it up. But you may have to modify and work around the sensations of pain and discomfort, because nobody likes exercising when it hurts. It's unpleasant, it's uncomfortable, and it's not necessary, I think, a lot of the time.
So you don't want to completely stop doing training. I think that's, again, a common reaction. Doesn't necessarily help things, but you also don't want to continually aggravate the issue. Something, again, that David reiterated.
As is the case of a lot of tendinopathies, it tends to cause pain for a prolonged period of time.
Let's say my medial elbow is hurting, my inside of my elbow is hurting. Maybe I have a small inflammatory reaction that's happening because of the load that I'm passing through it, maybe via calisthenics or via ring work or whatever it might be. And if that is the case, then it might be that we have to pull you back a little bit from the intensity of that to give that inflammatory process time to settle, because that inflammatory process excites all the nerve endings in the tissues. And if it excites them, they send more input to the brain. And if that's sent to threat processing, your nervous system's going, don't really want this right now. Can we offload that a little bit and manage that to get you back up to that level of condition and that's required? If that's the case, then happy days. If that doesn't happen and you keep pushing, maybe you do start to inflame and overload something. And then we have to kind of settle that bit and then gradually bring you back up again.
So ultimately, this comes down to regressing movements or modifying movements so that you can find a way of training the patterns that hurt, which ultimately, with the case of golfer's elbow, is going to be probably pulling movements, maybe some overhead pressing movements, maybe handstands also can aggravate things. But often this kind of tends to be personal, and you're going to know what annoys you because you're the person experiencing it. So ultimately, we need to consider our training. How can we move things about and how can we change things so that we don't necessarily get an inhibitory amount of pain during our session? How do we not make this injury any worse? And again, Adam had some great recommendations here.
A lot of medial elbow pain gets pain on pulling movements, so your chin ups and things along those lines. And simply just changing either from a supinated to a pronated to a neutral grip, it's the simplest way to work around an elbow tendon that's pissed off. Just find a grip that feels less uncomfortable. Maybe even different handles as well, because of different widths of the grip.
Yeah,
so a closed grip versus a fat grip. All these things you can play around, and there's no hard and fast rules. What works for one person's elbow doesn't work for another person's elbow, so it's a bit of trial and error. Find what fits with your current situation.
Perhaps using like lifting straps that you would usually use for deadlifting. Would you think that's a viable option?
Absolutely, just reduces the effort of the grip. So it just takes the load of the actual flexor tendons that are obviously squeezing and gripping down by X amount of degrees. And again, it can just deload a tendon whilst it's in an irritable state and allow it to, calm down.
So very simply, change the grip position. As I mentioned at the end there about the wrist straps, that's something that I first used when I had this injury. So I could continue to train pull-ups without pain. I just used wrist lifting straps. It took a lot of the load off those forearm flexors, and it allowed me to do some relatively normal training without any pain whatsoever, and also probably not going to aggravate that tissue further. I also personally, again, this is a personal thing, not necessarily a blanket statement, I found that neutral grip work also took a lot of that load off those forearm flexors. It's going to incorporate more in that brachialis, that brachioradialis as well, two big muscles that help those elbow flexors, and it's going to strengthen those. Also, like neutral grip is something that we don't necessarily do a whole lot of in bodyweight training, but it's actually a very useful grip pattern to train. I also like this point that David made in regards to it not always being about the forearm flexors. Sometimes it's about different points in that movement as well.
Probably the thing when it comes to getting towards those end stages of like rehab as such as you probably don't have the general pain in that area, but there might be one or two positions that still elicit that pain. And is that potentially like telling you something that like, okay, this is the portion of a movement or the area of a pattern that you need to be aware of?
Yeah, so I definitely think in terms of lines of force. When I'm in clinic with someone, so if I put you into a position where, let's say you're doing some sort of chin, or you've got like a false grip or something, and that's where you get the problem, I know that that's quite a hard position for your wrist flexors to hold. That's inner range for wrist flexors. That's quite hard anyway. So if they are asked to do more in that position because something around here is not able to stabilize, then it'll show up in that position. So you do have to get kind of quite specific at times. So if there is like the general pain is done or is more or less sorted out, and then specific positions, but I'll go in and I'll assess your ability to produce and control forces throughout the whole chain in those positions, and then see, is there something that maybe doesn't do what it could?
So although David didn't mention it here, I think potentially a good solution to this, and this is my own opinion, not David's, is using isometrics. So if we know, for example, that we get pain in a movement at a certain point, then we can actually just repeat that point, create that same joint position, but at a lower intensity. So if we get pain with just our body weight, then maybe we do it like with our feet assisting, so our feet giving us a bit of support below or banded, and then we can try and hold that position isometrically. Now, isometrics are great because it helps that improve that general intermuscular and intramuscular coordination. It helps us contract better in that position. So if something in that chain isn't firing correctly, by doing an isometric, hopefully we can build a better understanding there and create a better position. This also goes into some other recommendations I've made in the past and things I've heard from physios, which is like, okay, if we're progressing from an injury, generally it's like we start with isometrics and then we'll move to isotonic or dynamic movements. So in reality, from speaking to David and also Adam, it doesn't seem that we need to change our training that much. We don't need to include a lot of these fancy rehab exercises when it comes to rehabbing for golfer's elbow. We need to just take load off the injured area, and we need to be smart about it. So we need to modify our training so that we don't get that elicit of pain, and then we just need to gradually build up that capacity in the tendons. There is a couple of exercises that I like specifically for those areas, and I have shared them in both that forearm, the bulletproofing forearm video, and also in one that I did on the elbows as well. Again, I'll link to both of those down below. So the exercises that I particularly like were, number one, hammer rotations, because this specifically gets that pronator teres and a couple of other muscles in the forearm, which are generally going to be an issue with golfer's elbow. I'm a big fan of that one. Again, you can load it very progressively because it's weight, so we can start very light and we can build up. I'm also a big fan of hammer curls. Again, coming back to what we mentioned earlier about the brachialis and the brachioradialis. And also we're going to start training a little bit more of those wrist extensors as well, the opposing side of the muscle group that isn't the wrist flexors. Again, can help balance out the wrist a bit. I'm a big fan of neutral grip hammer curls. I also made a recommendation to Gabo Saturno. Again, another great YouTube channel, calisthenics based. He was having some issues with golfer's elbow pain. I recommended him trying out the hammer curls and he found that of great benefit as well. Again, anecdotal evidence. This needs to be addressed at the individual level, but it's worth trying out. As Adam said, you need to try these things out and find what works for you, and also revisit those exercises throughout your rehab process. After a month, maybe a certain exercise is too much for you too soon, but after 3 months, that exercise might be very useful to you.
The thing I always say to people is it shouldn't always be a permanent change. So because you're modifying something at the moment because you're in pain, that's all well and good, but it doesn't mean that's going to be the case all the time. So, if you go into straps just to allow this tendon to calm down, you do want to consider going back to not using straps later on once it starts to feel like it has settled down.
But it's important to consider that when we're doing these movements, we shouldn't be in a lot of pain. And I think both Adam and David reiterated this. Like, they're not trying to get you to do things that hurt. That's not the point of this. But having a little bit of pain when you're training isn't necessarily a bad thing. The thing that I would watch out for is if that pain persists after you finish the session. If you notice that it gets increasingly achy in that evening or the day after, then that's maybe a sign that you're doing a little bit too much too soon in that particular way. This long-term aspect, this kind of revisiting movements and grading that exposure and gradually increasing back in, kind of takes me on to the point number 3, which is long-term progress, return to sport. And this is kind of like the crux of it, which is what a lot of people want to know, and that's like, how long is it going to take to recover from golfer's elbow? And again, Adam summed this up very nicely.
Time is the factor that I think a lot of people don't understand with these elbow things. They think a couple of weeks and it'll start feeling better again. And the research and the evidence doesn't tell us that at all. It's normally, 6 to 12 months is the average time frame. So people need to be informed of that right at the beginning. I'll say, look, you've pissed this tendon off. Okay, good news. It's not serious. It's not sinister. Can't find any of these worrying features. Not so good news is it's probably going to linger around for 6 to 12 months, but it's not going to, hopefully, if we can find ways around it, it's not going to interfere too much. You can modify things whilst it's going through its sort of recovery process, and say a few months down the line, year down the line, worst case scenario, you'll be back to normal.
I think simply having that mentality that it's going to take that amount of time to recover from an injury makes the injury that much better or that much less worse. I don't know what the right English is, but this is just something that I've personally experienced. Like, I can remember getting injured earlier on in my training. So certainly when I had probably the golfer's elbow was the first big issue that I had. And I remember like thinking at the time, oh, okay, this is going to be better in a few weeks, better in 4 weeks. Then like a few weeks would pass and be like, okay, just be another few weeks. And that in itself actually caused quite a bit of anxiety and stress in relation to the injury, and I think it actually made things worse. Again, something that David touched on about how emotions play into injuries. So certainly now, later on in my training age, I'm much better at having a realistic understanding of how long injuries take to heal, because I've been there and done that. And that has made my attitude to injuries that much better. Yes, it sucks at the end of the day. You don't want to have an injury that's going to last 6 to 12 months. But also, it's much better to know that this is going to be around for that long and you can plan and train around it. It also means that you can focus on other goals. There's still plenty of things you can train for if you've got some injured elbows. It's actually, during the year, essentially, that I had off from proper training with my golfer's elbow, I achieved the middle splits. Like, why not? There's so many things that you can be working on. It's easy to not be able to see the forest through the trees, right? I really, really encourage you, just for your own sort of mental happiness when it comes to training, like if you've got this elbow injury, try and set some goals that are lower limb related, and just focus on them a little bit more, and just keep the upper body stuff ticking over. Or even, focus a little bit less on strength and focus a little bit more on flexibility goals like bridge or something, if that doesn't aggravate the elbow. And lastly, I want to touch on this pain that persists for a long time. And because certainly with my experience of golfer's elbow, it took a year for me to get back to normal training, but still then I would experience times where I'd still have pain in my elbows. Like, even probably up until the last year. So this elbow injury was like 4 years ago now, like 4 years later, I'd still get the odd occasion where I get pain in my elbow. And I'd be like, I know there's nothing wrong with it, but I get some pain there. Just that little small thing. And it's just that reaction that you're like, oh crap, is it still there? Oh no, it's back. So I just wanted to leave with a couple of points from both Adam and David where they really go into this concept of pain and its long-term implications. That's one of the things I wanted to chat to both of them most about. So I'm just going to leave that one to play for both of them as a little bit of a way of finishing off this one.
The simple way I often try to explain that is that, you know, and it's not 100% accurate, but it's close enough that I think most people understand it, is that pain has a memory. You know, so once you have a painful experience because of a pathological, physiological change to something, even though that pathology has gone through its healing process and recovered, your neural system has rewired because of the pathology and the pain that you've had for a period of time. And so you're still going to find that sometimes there are factors in your neurology that will still create some sensations of pain, even though you've got no pathology. And it's contextual most of the time. There's some environmental or contextual trigger that will sometimes give you a perception of pain, even though you haven't got the pathology. It's a bit like remembering something out of the blue. Just because you got triggered, you saw a photograph or you smelt something that reminded you of a nice holiday you had, you know, it just brought that memory to the forefront. And occasionally that's what happens with pain. You grip something the wrong way, you do an exercise that's slightly different, and it just gives you that memory of what you had a year, 2 or 3 down the line.
I'll meet people who have back pain for 25 years and they've had all the scans. They don't have anything untoward. They don't have any nerve compression. They don't have any real issues that are, you know, contributing to their symptoms. But they've had a hell of a lot of learning to how to protect themselves and to change their behavior. And they've had a lot of labels and diagnoses given to them and a lot of explanations given to them. And all of that stuff is sometimes can become what traps that person into a cycle of fear and worry and protection and deconditioning and being less able to do things, and that kind of cycles them. Then it's about reversing that if it's possible.
Yeah, so you're saying because they've had it for so long, they kind of just accepted that as, you know, they formed some identity around it perhaps, and
probably from in their memory that they have had plenty of previous experiences of pain, and that's something that their nervous system continually references when it's judging safety or not.
Okay, so I see. That makes sense. So you need to override that judgment factor with more positive experiences than negative experiences with that pain.
Exactly. That's where evidence of safety comes in for me.
So that's it. I understand that this one's pretty long. It's going to basically be another mini podcast, but I got a lot of positive feedback when I did this about the gymnast video. So I think it'll be useful, especially to those who are suffering from golfer's elbow. I really hope this is helpful for you. And just in general in injuries, like, don't stress out. Injuries happen. As much as, you know, it's nice to think that you shouldn't get injured. Sometimes they happen. It's like unexpected things come up. And I always like to think of injuries as a learning opportunity. Like, why did I get this injury? What can I improve? What can I strengthen? How can I improve my practice to make sure this doesn't come about again? Is my diet need to be improved because I haven't been eating enough and blah, 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 blah. Can I change that? Does my movement patterns need to be improved so I take the strain off this area and I overall get stronger, get more efficient? Or can I take this time to focus on something else that I've otherwise been neglecting? There's always opportunity in any of these adversities that come up in our training. You just kind of need to be sometimes just need to take a step back and make sure you realize them for what they are. And that's kind of it. That's kind of my 2 cents on the golfer's elbow. And I'm really grateful for both Adam and David for their input on here. Some of the opinions that I expressed might not be something that Adam and David agree with. Like, I obviously had my chats with them. The things that they've said, that's what they believe. Doesn't necessarily mean that they agree with the entire video. So just take that as my opinion. But I think they gave some really good advice for people just to go away and apply. If you do have any questions about this particular topic, I'm sure you probably have already done so if you've got to this far in the video, but feel free to leave a comment in the comment section down below and join the conversation. If you just enjoyed this video, found it helpful, hit that thumbs up button and support the channel. Right next to it is also that subscribe button if you want to join the Bodyweight Warrior tribe and don't miss out on any more future videos. But that's basically it, guys. I'll catch you in the next one. Have a strong week and peace.